Angus Robertson.
Mr Cosby, and it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship and to follow the honourable gentleman. I can give him the assurance that my honourable and right honourable friends on these benches will be resolute in our support of the Human Rights Act and the Convention on Human Rights. We're at the present time in proceedings, Mr Cosby, speaking about Group 2, about the Sewell Convention, and I would like to formally move new clause 10. Paragraph 22 of the Smith report, entitled Scottish Parliament Consent to the UK Parliament Making Law in Devolved Areas, recommended simply, and there's no room for ambiguity, that, and I quote, the Sewell Convention will be put on a statutory footing. And so the details of Clause 2 are really quite important. The Scotland Bill, as drafted, seeks to implement this recommendation by adding a new subsection, that's subsection 8, to section 28 of the Scotland Act. The positioning of this new provision is significant because the provision before, that section 28.7, makes an unambiguous assertion of Westminster's parliamentary sovereignty and the legislative supremacy of the UK Parliament. Section 28.7 declares that this section does not affect the power of the Parliament of the United Kingdom to make laws for Scotland. This is therefore a clear statement that Westminster continues to have the legal power to legislate for Scotland across devolved as well as reserved areas of public policy. Clause 2 of the draft Scotland Bill inserts section 28.8. But it is recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom will not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. In its report, that's in paragraph 61, the Scottish Parliament's Devolution Further Powers Committee considered that the current draft clause placed, and I quote, the purpose of the Sewell Convention in statute, but does not incorporate in legislation the process for consultation and consent where Westminster plans to legislate in a devolved area. In addition, the committee recommended that the words, but is recognised, and normally in the draft clause should be removed because they weaken the intention of the Smith recommendations. And we agree with the committee's analysis. That's the same committee that was made mention of earlier, the committee that is all-party on all sides, with members from all the political parties on all sides of this House. And we in these benches agree with that committee's analysis. The current clause fails to implement the Smith recommendation in 3 specific respects, and I'd like to come to them in turn. Firstly, amendments to the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. The Sewell Convention, as set out in Devolution Guidance Note 10, otherwise known as DGN 10, also requires the consent of the Scottish Parliament to Westminster legislation which alters the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament or the executive competence of the Scottish ministers. The draft clause does not refer to either of these categories. This is a significant omission. As the House of Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee noted, I look again to the honourable gentleman, no doubt he will remember this, in that report it notes, and I quote, we heard in oral evidence from Professor McHarg and in written evidence from Dr Adam Tucker and Dr Adam Perry that the draft clause failed to acknowledge the full scope of the Sewell Convention as it is currently applied in practice. The clause refers only to the Convention's applicability in respect of devolved matters. It was pointed out to us that the Convention is also applied to legislation affecting the competences of the devolved institution. This is reflected in the UK Government's Devolution Guidance Note 10, which states that a bill requiring Scottish parliamentary consent under the Sewell Convention is one which contains provisions applying to Scotland and which are for devolved purposes, or which alter the legislative competence of the Parliament or the executive competence of the Scottish ministers. DGN 10 is referred to in the command paper containing the draft clauses as follows. It is expected that the practice developed under Devolution Guidance Notes 10 will continue. But DGN 10 has no legal effect, but sets out how the UK Government's departments legislating in Scotland will meet the terms of the Convention. This practice is not reflected in the drafting of Clause 2. The second issue that I want to raise in this regard reflects the issue around statute as a convention. The draft clause puts the Sewell Convention into legislation as a convention rather than putting the convention on a statutory footing. As the Scottish Government has pointed out to the Scottish Parliament Committee, this is very different from precedents where the UK has placed other conventions on a statutory footing, such as the Ponsonby Convention relating to treaty ratification. Again, as the House of Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee noted, We consider that Draft Clause 2 does not give the Sewell Convention the force of statute, but may strengthen the Convention politically. We believe it fails to acknowledge that the Convention extends to legislation affecting the competences of the devolved institutions. We recommend that the presence of the word normally in the Sewell Convention and the applicability of the Convention to legislation affecting the competences of the devolved institutions be addressed in any redrafting of Draft Clause 2. On the consultation requirement, as has been widely noted and set out in DGN 10, the effective operation of the Sewell Convention depends on the consultation between Scottish and UK governments, something which the Secretary of State for Scotland has made play on in the earlier stages of today. The draft clause, however, fails to include any consultation requirements. Now, the Scottish Government's alternative clause, which we have tabled as a new clause amendment to the bill, addresses these deficiencies and properly places the Sewell Convention on a statutory footing. The opening subsection of the alternative draft adds to Section 28 of the Scotland Act by providing a clear statement of the Sewell Convention that the UK Parliament must not pass acts applying to Scotland about a devolved matter without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. It then defines about a devolved matter to encompass all three categories covered by DGN 10, that is, legislation in a devolved area, changing the legislative competences of the Scottish Parliament, and adjusting the executive competences of the Scottish Government. The alternative clause then provides for a new Section 28A to be inserted into the Scotland Act. This is a straightforward consultation provision requiring the UK Government to consult with the Scottish Government before introducing to Westminster bills that apply to Scotland. Where the Westminster Bill would require the consent of the Scottish Parliament under Section 28 as amended, the UK Government should share a copy of the provisions of the bill that apply to Scotland with the Scottish Government 21 days before introduction at Westminster. However, there is an understanding that on occasion it is necessary to expedite the legislative process, and therefore the alternative clause is pragmatic and flexible in allowing the consultation requirement to be curtailed in certain circumstances. Now, the Scottish Parliament has, of course, looked at the clauses proposed by the Government, and they consider, in their own words, that the current draft clause, whilst placing the purpose of the Sewell Convention in statute, does not incorporate in legislation the process for consultation and consent, where Westminster plans to legislate in a devolved area. The committee considers that it should do so. Moreover, the committee considers that the use of the words "but it is recognised" and "normally" has a potential to weaken the intention of the Smith Commission's recommendations in this area, and recommends that these words be removed from the draft clause. For those reasons, I would urge members on all sides to support the measure we are promoting this evening. The Scottish Parliament's Devolution Committee, in response to the published bill, said that the committee called for these words to be removed from the draft clause. However, there has been no change. Clause 2 in the Scotland Bill is identical to draft Clause 2 that we saw so many months ago. So I say to the Secretary of State, I'm hoping to catch his ear, I'd be very interested at some stage in the proceedings, when we hear about listening, when we hear about reflecting, when we hear about improvements, when we hear about cooperation, when we hear about the UK Government listening to the points that have been made by the Scottish Government, from the Scottish National Party or other political parties in the House, I would love to know at what point the Government actually intends to take forward these improvements, accept them, and improve the bill. As far as the SNP is concerned, we do not consider that the clause as drafted implements the Smith recommendation. As I have laid before the House this evening a case, it is something that is agreed by all political parties in the Scottish Parliament, this critique, and I would hope that the UK Government will take that on board. The draft clause puts the Sewell Convention as a convention into statute rather than putting the convention on a statutory footing, as has been required by paragraph 22 of the Smith report. It's our view that the intention of the Smith recommendations was that key aspects of Devolution Guidance Note 10 would be codified in statute. As it stands, the clause sets out the basic principle, but provides no statutory process for consultation and consent where Westminster plans to legislate for Scotland in devolved areas. As things stand, the Scotland Bill has not been drafted to take account of the shortcomings It does not put the Sewell Convention on a meaningful statutory basis, does not adequately implement Smith, does not apply to changes to the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, nor executive competence of the Scottish ministers. And that is why we will be pressing for these changes this evening.
Hear, hear.